After reaching their artistic peak with Sgt. Pepper's and the historical participation in the TV special Our World, the Beatles were back in the public eye after months of absence since they stopped touring. To reaffirm their great moment, the band planned a movie accompanied by a soundtrack that would be the perfect closure to the year. But in August of 1967, everything came to a halt when their manager, Brian Epstein, was found dead. From that moment on, the band's roles and dynamics changed forever. Paul McCartney took over the leadership of the group in an improvised way, and the Magical Mystery Tour would become for many the beginning of the end.
George, can we take it? You know that.
Oh, no, mine was still a bit major.
Mine.
The individual paths of the Beatles would begin to be drawn here. After the release of Sgt. Pepper's, John Lennon began to take an interest in a Japanese artist he had met months earlier, and she slowly began to introduce herself into his life in whatever ways she could find. Her name was Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney met an American photographer at the Bag of Nails, and then they met again at the Sgt. Pepper's private party. Her name was Linda Eastman, who took the famous photographs of that night. George Harrison began his spiritual path, and this further distanced him from the other three, while Ringo was focused on his role as a family man and soon after began working as an actor. These separate events would be factors that in the future influenced the separation of the band, but that was still 2 years away.
Right. Oh, that's very good. Thank you, John. That's fine. I think that will do for the vocal backing very nicely. We'll get the musicians in now, and we'll do the last take.
Oh, great.
Okay. Run back the tape, please, Richard.
All you need is love.
In Our World, the first live international television production, the Beatles represented their country by singing their new song, All You Need Is Love. The powerful message of the single symbolized the summer of love and reflected the feelings of the time. The single was released on July 7th, and as usual, it was a worldwide hit, although it was hard to believe. And despite the success of the single and Sgt. Pepper's, EMI were concerned about the band's reputation. A couple songs from their last album had been censored by the BBC. A year later, they were still dealing with the consequences of Lennon's statements about Jesus Christ. And to make matters worse, Paul McCartney went public with his LSD use in a TV interview. The perception of the Beatles was changing, and Brian Epstein could do little to fix it. His relationship with the band was worn out. His contract was about to expire, and without touring activity, his role in the band was becoming less and less. Frightened, he was looking for a way to introduce himself into the band's new studio dynamic, but he was not succeeding. And this generated depressive chapters in his life. Pattie Boyd made contact with the spiritual regeneration movement led by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and when George Harrison learned about the mantras and the spirituality they proclaimed, he immediately became interested in the subject and soon invited his bandmates to a conference on August 24th. And although Ringo was unable to attend, the Beatles saw meditation as an escape to channel some of their voids. They presented themselves to the Maharishi, and he invited them to a 5-day Transcendental Meditation retreat in Bangor that would bring them much closer to the spirituality they sought. The Beatles accepted and went, and in the middle of an activity, the only available phone kept ringing. Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend, answered. It was Peter Brown, who asked to be connected to Paul. Brian Epstein was dead. On the night of Sunday, 27th of August, 1967, the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, was found dead at his home in Chapel Street, London. An inquest found the cause of death to be accidental, resulting from incautious self-overdoses of carbital, a drug taken to assist sleep. The news left the Beatles in shock. His body was cremated in the Jewish cemetery in Liverpool, and John Lennon, the closest member of the group, mourned the abandonment of his friend. The guilt tormented him for the rest of his life. Brian's death started a new era for the band. They didn't know what to do without him. He had been with them since 1962, and at a meeting at Paul McCartney's house the next day, they questioned their future, in which the band would decide that now they alone would manage their career. They found no better formula for their mourning than to return to the studio. And in the search for any project that would keep them together, Paul McCartney rethought the Magical Mystery Tour project, which had been discussed earlier in the year. The plan seemed simple: shoot a movie, record some songs for the soundtrack, and move on. The Beatles were beginning to live out the end of their days as a group, and with this project, it seemed that in some way, the Beatles were beginning to buy time. It is necessary to say that the album was released as a double EP in England and as an LP in the USA. And although originally the work was only conceived as the soundtrack of the film, it was until 1986 when it was considered an official album of the band, already with the singles of the time added on the B-side of the album. So, the analysis will focus on the LP in a more complete way. The opening theme of the album and the film was conceived by Paul McCartney. The band invites the passengers to the trip, and the roll-up has several interpretations, where Paul emphasized that he had taken it from a circus. It was recorded in April 1967, when the film was only a sketch in the air, and the recording was not taken so seriously, even had deficiencies in the mix, but this would give it a certain spontaneous touch that would contribute to the nature of the film, giving the listener the feeling of the beginning of a trip. The Fool on the Hill is a song composed by Paul McCartney during the Sgt. Pepper's sessions. It is surprising that even though it was not finished, it did not have a place in the tracklist of that album. But in Magical, it enjoyed a leading role. Composed in mockery of the Maharishi, Paul makes one of his most beautiful melodies, recorded with only Paul at the piano, and later complemented by the other elements. It immediately became an essential part of the Beatles songbook. Originally titled Aerial Tour Instrumental, this song was the second instrumental theme of the Beatles after Cry for a Shadow, another track that had not been released until the anthologies in their official discography. With the essence of a soundtrack, the song was credited to the four Beatles as composers. It is dreamlike and psychedelic, and the mellotron plays as the guiding instrument. Blue Jay Way is an interesting song, but at first it was underrated. George Harrison's contribution was not looked upon favorably by either his bandmates or his producer. The song was composed by George Harrison in Los Angeles and recorded in September of 1967. The inspiration came when Harrison was staying in a house in the Hollywood Hills, on Blue Jay Way. While waiting for Derek Taylor, Harrison, bored, wrote this song. Your Mother Should Know is one more of the nostalgic chapters that Paul McCartney had in the Beatles. Here, he makes a wink to the great years of the music hall. With his childhood as a recurring theme, he writes a waltz that, from the beginning, was conceived as the end of the film. Abbey Road was not available that day, so they had to move to Chapel Studios. The song stands out for the great vocal treatment used by George Martin in the recording, but despite that, it ended up being one of those tunes that did not excite the band much, and was one of the first appearances of the young Ken Scott in the sound engineering, who was also beginning to replace Jeff Emmerich. I Am the Walrus is for many the most interesting piece on the album. In John Lennon's words, in 100 years, we would still be talking about it, and 55 years later, we have proof that he was right. It represented a perfectly crafted combination of his artistic and intimate interests. Lennon already admired Yoko. The Walrus came out of Alice in Wonderland, and some other characters are also part of the literary work of Lewis Carroll. It is a surrealist and abstract song. George Martin's work was huge. It was recorded in September and became an extraordinary passage on the album.
You say yes.
From here on, the following songs were not part of the original project and appeared on the tracklist as a measure of the label to find a place for them and also to raise the commercial scope of the album. Hello Goodbye was another extraordinary commercial tune by McCartney. Recorded between October and November 1967, the song was chosen as the A-side of the band's new single, which annoyed Lennon by having to put I'm the Walrus as the B-side. With the release of the song, McCartney gave an explanation of its meaning in an interview about the album. The answer to everything is simple. It's a song about everything and nothing. If you have black, you have to have white. That's the amazing thing about life, said Paul McCartney in the interview. Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane are introduced to the album as the most distant tracks to the project, as they were conceived as part of the Sgt. Pepper's. Their introduction here is the most forced on the track list. Yet, they turn out to be incredible moments for the listener. The B-side of the album is full of hits, 2 songs composed based on John and Paul's childhoods respectively, and above all, standards of change and musical evolution of the Beatles. This song is a collaborative effort by John and Paul. Baby You're a Rich Man was originally an unfinished McCartney song, which was mixed with One of the Beautiful People, an unfinished Lennon song. This formula of joining 2 songs had already been used in A Day in the Life, and then they would do it in I've Got a Feeling. Baby You're a Rich Man was recorded at Olympic Sound and was the first time the group recorded outside of Abbey Road. And in terms of lyrics, Lennon had made some winks to Brian Epstein, to whom he ironically shouted that he was a rich man. where even the first takes allude in the lyrics to Brian's sexual orientation, and one more of the bad jokes that John used to make. The album closes with All You Need Is Love, being the B-side of the album, the one that housed the band's singles of that year. The song was already an anthem, and it was not convenient for everyone to leave it out of the band's discography. And although it was not originally conceived this way, it ended up giving the album a final atmosphere. Magical Mystery Tour was released in its two versions on November 27th in the US and December 8th in the UK. In its first 3 weeks on sale in the US, it set a record, as it had the highest initial sales of any LP Capitol had ever released. It was also number 1 on the Billboard for 8 weeks and remained in the top 200 until February 8th, 1969. Despite widespread media attacks on the film, the soundtrack was a commercial and critical success. NME said that the Beatles were once again pushing pop music to its limits. Even among the reviews of the US LP, some critics chose Magical Mystery Tour as the best work of the Beatles up to that moment. However, there were also a few complaints about the tracklist, where some critics labeled a couple of the album's tracks as disappointing. As part of the usual format, the Beatles decided to package the two EPs with a 24-page gatefold cover. The album cover featured a photo of the Beatles in animal costumes, taken during the filming of I Am the Walrus. The first time the faces of the group members were not visible on the cover. This album booklet contained the lyrics of the songs, as well as color stills from the film, and comic strip-style illustrations by cartoonist Bob Gibson. The cover design was done by John Van Hammersveld, head of Capitol's art department. In 1987, Magical Mystery Tour became part of the band's official discography with the international standardization of the Beatles catalog. Magical Mystery Tour was also the first Beatles EP to be released in mono and stereo, and the mono version is currently offline. The album cover was also later cited by defenders of the Paul is dead theory as evidence. The clues included the appearance of a black walrus, Paul McCartney with a black carnation on the back cover, and one page of the booklet featured McCartney sitting behind a sign that read, "I was." Magical Mystery Tour was released in the UK on December 8th, one day after the opening of their Apple boutique in central London, and just over 2 weeks before the BBC broadcast the film. While the Beatles were recording Your Mother Should Know, Brian Epstein went to see them in the studio, and that August 23rd would be the last time the group would see him alive. The footage in the film during the flying musical number is leftover sequences shot by Stanley Kubrick for his film 2001: A Space Odyssey. 3 promotional films were made for the song Hello Goodbye, directed by McCartney, filmed at the Seville Theatre in London. The music videos were not broadcast by the BBC due to the Musicians' Union's strict rules regarding lip sync, but regardless of these restrictions in the US, one of them was shown on The Ed Sullivan Show in November 26, 1967. The Beatles were upset when Brian Epstein did not consult them before confirming their participation in Our World. With a few days' notice, they prepared All You Need Is Love. I Am the Walrus used several BBC recordings for its final mix, where fragments of Shakespeare's tragedy of King Lear stand out.
And give the letters which thou find'st about me to Edmund, Earl of Gloucester. Seek him out upon the British party. Oh, untimely death. Death.
According to experts, the release of Magical Mystery Tour inadvertently put an end to the psychedelic pop movement. Magical Mystery Tour was managed as a somewhat forced project to keep the band together after the loss of their manager. The idea resulted in a controversial film and an amazing soundtrack, where even with the creative waves of the Sgt. Peppers, they gave the band material to close their psychedelic stage with one more album. The Beatles strengthened their individual paths and started 1968 full of uncertainty, and although the separation was still far away, for many, it was the beginning of the end. But you have the best opinion. Tell us below what you think about it, and what are your impressions of the album. Subscribe to our channel and like us. Thanks for watching. This is Music Box.